A topic that seems quite controversial lately is how many sexes and genders there are. I've never understood why this is such a big deal. Why do people get so upset by the idea that intersex people, for example, don't neatly fit into a binary conception of sex? Why do people throw a fit whenever someone proposes that maybe sex is more complicated than just male and female? Here's a reasonable non-fit throwing exchange I had some time ago with Gary Edwards with regard to the question of the most useful way to count the number of biological sexes. Gary believes that the sexes should be counted according to the presence or absence of a functional SRY gene. This is the gene that usually triggers the development of testicles and other features typically categorized as male in the course of human gestation. I think this is too restrictive a standard because it isn't particularly practical with regard to the ways we most typically use the concept of sex and distinguish between the sexes. Gary says, given this, and in the light of the best science of which I'm aware, and I've made it my business to find out, rather than radical expansion, our theory of biological sex as a binary merely needs to be reoriented away from an account of phenomenal regularities, and towards the natural history of sexual reproduction, and our species' place in that history. I think there's value in explaining our species' place in the natural history of sexual reproduction, but that is far from being the only useful distinction between sexes. I don't even think it's the most useful distinction. So I said, I don't understand the advantage of reorienting sexual categories away from something so useful as phenomenal regularities. And Gary says, the advantage is causal theories. These pay off in a number of ways, including potentially better taxonomies of phenomena. And I said, I don't see why it's more advantageous for taxonomy, at least when it comes to distinguishing sexes, to explain phenomena rather than describe it. To relegate the label biological male to merely describing where someone fits in the natural history of sexual reproduction is to make it less useful with regard to describing what it is most often intended to describe, which is what role a person is able to play in reproduction. We need a categorical system that serves this function. Perhaps we should distinguish between genetic maleness or femaleness and phenotypical maleness or femaleness. I think it would be fair and sufficiently descriptive to say that someone with androgen insensitivity syndrome is genetically male but not phenotypically male. Folks with androgen insensitivity syndrome have genitals and secondary sex characteristics typically categorized as female but also have XY chromosomes. Without invasive medical examination, it is usually very difficult to distinguish folks with this condition from women with XX chromosomes. I see the advantage of the genetic sex distinction, but I also see an indispensable distinction between phenotypical sex categories that are a lot more complicated than the genetic binary. Why shouldn't we recognize both? Why can't we say that a person with androgen insensitivity syndrome is genetically male, but not phenotypically male? Gary says, it's advantageous because we don't want to just put what happens in the correct box, we want to accurately predict it and offer reasonable explanation of it. Causal theories and the experimental research that they open up allow us to do this in a way which merely putting observations neatly in a scrapbook do not. And I said, I think we should do both. That's why I think we should make a distinction between genetic sex and phenotypical sex. That way we get the advantage of having both a causal theory and a neat scrapbook. And Gary says, should we have two taxonomic schemes for animals, one in which bats are birds and whales fish, and one in which both bats and whales are mammals? Or should we just opt for the deeper explanatory model that underpins the latter classification? And I said, depends on what we're doing with these animals. There are certainly situations in which a distinction between non-winged animals and winged animals is more useful than knowing how those wings evolved. I wouldn't use the term bird because that would create more confusion rather than less, because we haven't used the term bird to simply mean winged animal for a long time. If, however, it had been the case that we continued to use the term to mean any winged animal, or fish to refer to any vertebrate that doesn't go on land, then yeah, it would make sense to have two classifications. For example, it is generally accepted that botanists and chefs define fruit differently. I think it's appropriate that they do so. The botanist's definition of fruit simply is not as useful for chef. And Gary says, I disagree. I think chefs who use tomatoes need to revise their theories about fruit. But why? Why ought chefs abandon the gastronomical distinction between what is and is not a fruit that is most useful to them in favor of the botanical distinction which is far less useful to them in the vast majority of situations to which they apply the concept? Why can't everyone simply recognize that there is a gastronomical way to distinguish between a fruit and a non-fruit, and a botanical way to make that distinction? Analogously, why can't we recognize that there is a genetic distinction between sexes, and that there is also a phenotypical distinction that takes into account the greater complexity of phenotypical varieties that don't fit neatly into a binary, such as folks with androgen insensitivity syndrome and Turner syndrome, etc. Given that they are both useful in their own way, what is the problem with that? A common rebuttal is that these are just anomalies. So what? What's the problem with having an anomalous category, or a category in which we place anomalies? To everyone who helps me out on Patreon, you're a big help. Thanks so much.